The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the quiet streets of Magnolia Lane, a neighborhood that had held Eleanor Williams's heart for more than 40 years. It was a place she knew well, where each crack in the sidewalk and every neighbor's rosebush felt familiar. Eleanor was a woman of rhythm, and today, like most Wednesdays, she prepared for her weekly visit to Greenfield Groceries. At 75, Eleanor moved through life at her own pace. Her body, though still strong, occasionally reminded her of its limits. Her hands, marked with traces of arthritis, moved deliberately as she slipped on her coat and reached for her shopping list. The list itself was modest: bread, milk, a few vegetables, but the trip was more than just about groceries. It was about connection, even if fleeting, with the world beyond her quiet home. The short walk to the store was pleasant, the kind of small joy Eleanor had come to appreciate with age. The golden leaves rustled gently in the breeze, and the sound of children's laughter echoed faintly from a park down the street. Life, in its simplicity, carried on. Greenfield Groceries sat at the corner of Maple and Pine, a neighborhood staple where Eleanor was a familiar face. The employees greeted her warmly, a comfort in a world that often felt as though it had moved on without her. The automatic doors slid open with a soft hum, and Eleanor stepped inside, the cool air of the store brushing against her cheeks. She reached for a shopping cart, the familiar rattle of its wheels a reminder of countless trips like this one. The aisles were quiet today, save for the occasional murmur of other shoppers and the soft hum of fluorescent lights. Eleanor took her time, carefully selecting potatoes, inspecting each one as though it were a small treasure. She moved with purpose but without rush. Time, after all, was hers to spend. It wasn't until she reached the canned goods aisle that the air seemed to change. At first, it was a voice sharp, authoritative, and entirely out of place in the quiet rhythm of the store. "Move it, lady." The words cut through the stillness, loud enough to make Eleanor pause. She turned slowly, her polite instincts taking over even before her eyes landed on the source. Two police officers stood a few feet away, their uniforms crisp, their faces unreadable. The one who had spoken, Officer Harris. His name tag read, was broad-shouldered and imposing. His companion, Officer Blake, lingered a step behind, his expression carrying the faint trace of amusement. Eleanor blinked, unsure at first if the words had been meant for her. But as Officer Harris narrowed his eyes, it became clear. "I'm sorry, officer," she said quietly, moving her cart aside. "I didn't mean to block the aisle." She waited for the officer to move on, but he didn't. Instead, he stared at her for a moment longer than felt necessary, his gaze heavy with something unspoken. Eleanor, ever composed, turned her attention back to the shelves, hoping to diffuse the moment. She had learned long ago that some battles weren't worth the fight. As she moved into the next aisle, she heard their footsteps behind her. It was subtle at first, the kind of sound that could be easily ignored, but the weight of their presence was unmistakable. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she reached for a can of soup, the lid cold against her fingers. "There's a time limit for shopping. You know," Officer Harris said, his voice carrying a note of derision. "Some of us have jobs to do." Eleanor turned, her calm demeanor masking the growing unease in her chest. "I wasn't aware of such a rule," she replied evenly. "Well, now you are," he snapped. Behind him, Officer Blake chuckled softly, the sound grating against the quiet of the aisle. Eleanor wanted to ask why they were following her, what they hoped to accomplish by shadowing a woman picking out groceries. But she didn't. Years of experience had taught her that questions often invited more trouble than answers. She moved on, her cart now heavier than it had been moments ago, though not because of its contents. The weight she felt was deeper, pressing against her spirit. Around her, other shoppers glanced her way but quickly turned back to their business. Their silence was as familiar as it was painful, a reminder that when injustice unfolded, most people chose to look the other way. By the time Eleanor reached the dairy section, her composure had started to fray. Her legs ached, and her heart felt unsteady. She reached for a carton of milk, her hands shaking enough to make the carton wobble slightly as she placed it in her cart. "Why are you walking so slow?" Officer Harris's voice came again, sharp and impatient. Eleanor straightened, turning to face him with as much dignity as she could muster. "I'm an old woman, officer," she said quietly. "My legs don't move as fast as they used to." For a moment, he said nothing. Then he scoffed, a sound that carried no sympathy. "Maybe you shouldn't be out here then." The words stung more than she let on. But Eleanor held her ground. She wouldn't let them see how deeply they had cut. She had lived through too much segregation, protests, the quiet hum of subtle prejudices that never truly left to crumble now. As she turned to leave, she caught sight of Maria, one of the store employees. The young woman's face was a portrait of concern. Her hands froze in midair as she stalked a shelf. Eleanor offered her a small, reassuring smile, silently pleading for her not to intervene. This wasn't Maria's fight. And yet, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The walk home from Greenfield Groceries was familiar. A route Eleanor Williams could follow without thinking. The sidewalk was shaded by old oaks, their gnarled branches intertwined like watchful sentinels. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves. But today, Eleanor felt no comfort in their presence. The weight of what had happened at the store clung to her, heavier than the groceries in her cart. Eleanor paused at the crosswalk, her hand tightening around the handle of her small shopping trolley. She glanced over her shoulder, a movement that might have seemed casual to anyone watching. But it wasn't casual, it was cautious, deliberate. No one was there, just the usual scatter of pedestrians, a jogger in the distance, and the quiet hum of passing cars. Still, the feeling lingered, an unsettling itch beneath her skin. She told herself she was imagining things. She was too old to let childish fears get the best of her. By the time she reached her front porch, the familiar creak of the steps under her feet offered a fleeting sense of relief. She unlocked the door, stepped inside, and closed it behind her, leaning against it for a moment longer than usual. The quiet of her house, normally a comfort, felt unnaturally loud. Eleanor sighed and moved to the kitchen. She unpacked her groceries in silence, each item placed on the counter with careful precision. Potatoes in the basket, milk in the fridge, bread in the pantry. The rhythm of the task settled her nerves, though the feeling of unease lingered, like the faint scent of something burned. As she placed the last can of soup on the shelf, Eleanor's phone buzzed on the kitchen table. She glanced at it, expecting a message from her granddaughter Chloe, a regular checker-in who always seemed to know when Eleanor needed a kind word. But the message wasn't from Chloe. It wasn't from anyone she knew. "Watch your back." The words were simple but deliberate, their meaning clear. Eleanor stared at the screen for a long moment, the letters searing into her mind. Her first thought was that it must be a mistake, a message sent to the wrong number. But deep down, she knew better. Eleanor locked her phone and placed it face down on the table, her hands trembling slightly. She refused to let fear take hold. After all, she had faced worse in her life. She had walked through the world in times when signs on doors told her she wasn't welcome. She had sat on buses in silence, knowing her presence was an unspoken protest. She had learned to hold her head high, even when others tried to force it down. But this was different. This was quiet, invasive, and cold. Later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Eleanor tried to settle into her evening routine. She brewed a cup of tea, the familiar scent of chamomile filling the small kitchen. She opened the newspaper, scanning the headlines without much interest. But no matter how hard she tried, her thoughts kept circling back to the store, to the officers, to the text. She told herself it was coincidence, a random act of mischief from a stranger with nothing better to do. But she couldn't shake the image of Officer Harris's sharp eyes and his mocking tone. She couldn't forget the way his partner, Officer Blake, had laughed softly under his breath, as if her existence itself was a punchline. As she sat by the window, her tea cooling untouched in her hands, Eleanor noticed the faint glow of headlights through the curtains. A car, idling just beyond the edge of her driveway. It wasn't unusual for cars to pass through her neighborhood. Magnolia Lane was a peaceful, unremarkable place. But this car didn't pass. It stayed. Eleanor's heart quickened, though she forced herself to stay calm. She rose slowly, careful not to make a sound, and moved closer to the window, peeking through the curtains. She saw it. A black SUV with dark, mirrored windows that reflected the faint glow of the streetlights. The car didn't move, it just sat there, humming quietly, its presence as deliberate as the text message on her phone. Eleanor stepped back from the window. Her breathing shallow. She considered calling someone Chloe. Perhaps. Or her neighbor Mr. Evans. But what would she say? That a car she didn't recognize was parked outside her house? That she felt watched, though she had no proof? No, she wouldn't let fear make her seem paranoid. Not yet. After what felt like hours, the SUV finally pulled away, disappearing into the night like a shadow retreating from the light. Eleanor stood in the middle of her living room, the silence of the house pressing against her. She wanted to believe that it was over, that the car had been nothing more than a coincidence. But the knot of unease in her chest told her otherwise. That night, Eleanor double-checked the locks on her doors and windows before heading to bed. She lay awake for hours, her thoughts spinning like the blades of a restless fan. She thought of Officer Harris's eyes, the way they had lingered just a moment too long. She thought of the text message, the words etched into her mind. And she thought of the black SUV, its presence a silent question she couldn't answer. Sleep, when it finally came, was restless and filled with shadows. The morning light filtered softly through the lace curtains of Eleanor's bedroom, its warmth brushing against her face. She hadn't slept much. The night had been restless, her mind a maze of unanswered questions and quiet fears. But Eleanor had learned long ago how to mask tiredness. She rose from bed, washed her face, and smoothed down the edges of her short, graying hair. Routine was her anchor. In the kitchen, the familiar act of making breakfast offered a small comfort. The eggs sizzled softly in the pan, their golden edges curling just as Eleanor liked. She toasted 2 slices of bread, set out a small jar of marmalade, and arranged her plate neatly at the table. Yet, as she sat down to eat, the usual peace of her mornings felt distant. Her phone buzzed on the counter, its vibration startling in the stillness. Eleanor turned her head sharply, the memory of last night's message flashing in her mind. But when she picked it up, relief washed over her. It was a text from Chloe. Morning, Grandma. Just checking in. Let me know if you need anything. A faint smile crossed Eleanor's lips. Chloe had always been thoughtful, a bright thread in the fabric of Eleanor's life. She typed a quick reply, her fingers steady despite the lingering unease. Good morning, sweetheart. I'm fine. Just having breakfast. Hope you're doing well. As she set the phone back on the counter, Eleanor let out a slow breath. She considered telling Chloe about the officers, the text, and the SUV. But something held her back. Chloe had her own life to worry about: school, work, her friends. Eleanor didn't want to burden her with problems that might seem small to someone younger. Even if they didn't feel small to Eleanor. The day passed in quiet monotony. Eleanor busied herself with household chores, dusting the shelves, watering her plants, and folding the laundry. She tried to focus on the tasks at hand, but her thoughts kept drifting. Each sound from outside: a car passing, a dog barking, pulled her attention. She found herself glancing out the window more than usual, her eyes scanning the street for any sign of the black SUV. By late afternoon, Eleanor decided she needed to talk to someone. She picked up the phone and dialed Margaret, a friend she had known for decades. Margaret was the kind of person who always seemed to know what to say, her voice steady and her words full of quiet wisdom. Hello, Eleanor, Margaret greeted warmly. It's been a while. How are you? I'm all right, Eleanor replied, though the words felt hollow. I've just had a strange couple of days. Margaret picked up on the shift in her tone immediately. What's going on? You don't sound like yourself. Eleanor hesitated, glancing at the lace curtains framing her living room window. She had never been one to share her troubles openly, but the weight of the past few days pressed against her chest. She began slowly, recounting the incident at the grocery store. Her voice was steady but soft as she described the officers, how their words had sliced through her quiet routine, how their presence had loomed over her like a shadow. She spoke of the text message, its sharp warning, and the black SUV that had idled outside her house. Margaret listened without interruption, her occasional hum of acknowledgement the only sound on the other end of the line. When Eleanor finished, there was a moment of silence. That's terrible, Margaret finally said, her voice tinged with anger. They had no right to treat you that way. Eleanor nodded, though Margaret couldn't see her. I thought I could just forget about it. But it's been harder than I expected. It's like, they wanted me to feel small. Margaret sighed, the sound heavy with understanding. They probably did. That's how they get away with it. Eleanor, they intimidate people into silence. But you're stronger than that. I don't feel strong, Eleanor admitted. I feel tired, and afraid. What if they come back? What if they try to do something worse? Margaret's tone softened. Fear is normal, Eleanor, but don't let it control you. You've lived through worse, haven't you? Eleanor thought back to the years of her youth. The battles fought for dignity and equality. She remembered the marches, the signs, the songs of hope rising above the weight of oppression. She had been part of something larger then, a movement that demanded change. But now, in the quiet of her later years, she wondered if she had the strength to face another fight. I have, she said quietly, but this feels different. It feels personal. Margaret was silent for a moment before speaking again. Do you want me to come by? We can talk more, figure out what to do. Eleanor shook her head, though she appreciated the offer. No, Margaret, I think I just needed to talk to someone. All right, Margaret said gently, but if you need me, I'm here. Don't hesitate to call. After they hung up, Eleanor sat by the window, watching the shadows grow longer as the sun dipped toward the horizon. The street outside was quiet. The houses bathed in the soft glow of the evening light. It should have been peaceful. Instead, it felt fragile, as though the calm could shatter at any moment. Eleanor reached for her knitting basket, the familiar rhythm of the needles a comfort against the tide of her thoughts. As the yarn looped through her fingers, she thought about what Margaret had said. Fear was normal, but it couldn't be the final word. Eleanor didn't know what her next step would be, but she knew she couldn't let herself be silenced. Outside, the streetlights flickered on, their glow casting long shadows across the pavement. Eleanor set her knitting aside and stood, her reflection faint in the windowpane. For the first time in days, she felt a small flicker of resolve. She wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but she would face it, just as she had faced everything else in her life with quiet strength and unshakable dignity. The morning air was crisp, carrying with it the faint scent of dew on freshly cut grass. Eleanor Williams stepped outside, pulling her cardigan close against the chill. The world around her seemed unchanged, the hum of a distant lawnmower, the rhythmic chirping of birds, but inside, Eleanor felt the subtle shift of determination taking hold. For days, she had carried the weight of what had happened at Greenfield Groceries. The office's mocking words, the ominous text, and the lingering presence of the black SUV. But this morning, as she locked her front door and started the short walk to the community center, Eleanor resolved to seek clarity. Perhaps she wouldn't find answers, but at least she would no longer feel so alone in her questions. The community center stood at the corner of two modest streets, its brick facade weathered but welcoming. It was a place Eleanor had visited often over the years for potlucks, church meetings, and the occasional quilting group. Today, it felt different, as though its walls held the promise of understanding. Inside, the hum of quiet conversation filled the air. Eleanor spotted Mrs. Evelyn Clark near the coffee station, her petite frame wrapped in a floral scarf. Evelyn was pouring a cup of tea when she noticed Eleanor and waved her over with a warm smile. Eleanor, it's good to see you, Evelyn said, her voice steady and inviting. You're here early today. Eleanor nodded, her hands resting lightly on the strap of her handbag. I needed to talk about something that's been weighing on me. Evelyn's expression softened with concern. Of course, dear, let's sit. They found a quiet corner of the room, settling into a pair of well-worn chairs. Eleanor hesitated, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The words felt heavy, as though speaking them would make everything more real. But Evelyn waited patiently, her presence a steadying force. Eleanor began with the incident at the grocery store, recounting every detail with a calmness that surprised even herself. She described the officers, the weight of their stares, and the sharpness of their words. She spoke of the text message, its cold warning, and the black SUV that had parked outside her house. Evelyn listened intently, her brows furrowed and her hands still. When Eleanor finished, the silence between them was thick but not uncomfortable. "That's unacceptable," Evelyn said finally, her voice quiet but firm. "No one should be treated that way. Eleanor, least of all someone like you." Eleanor managed a small smile. "Someone like me? You've spent your whole life here," Evelyn said, gesturing toward the window as if to encompass the neighborhood. "You've raised children, volunteered at the church, been a good neighbor. If anyone should feel safe here, it's you." Eleanor looked down at her hands, her thoughts swirling. "It's not just about feeling safe, Evelyn. It's about feeling seen, respected. And it's not the first time I've felt this way. Maybe not as blatant, but it's there in the looks. The pauses, the unspoken things." Evelyn nodded, her face somber. "It's the weight of being invisible and too visible at the same time." "Yes," Eleanor said softly, surprised at how perfectly Evelyn had captured her feelings. The two women sat in silence for a moment, the murmur of the room fading into the background. Finally, Evelyn leaned forward, her hands resting lightly on Eleanor's knee. "You don't have to carry this alone," she said. "Have you thought about speaking out? Sharing your story with the community?" Eleanor hesitated. The idea of opening herself up, of placing her experience under the scrutiny of others, made her stomach tighten. But she also knew Evelyn was right. Silence had done little to ease her burden. "I don't know," Eleanor admitted. "What if they don't believe me? What if it just makes things worse?" Evelyn's gaze was steady. "And what if it makes things better? What if your story helps someone else find the courage to speak up?" Sometimes, the act of telling is as important as the truth itself. Eleanor considered this, her mind returning to the countless moments in her life when speaking up had felt like an impossible choice. But she also thought of the quiet strength that had carried her through those moments, the resilience that had defined so much of her journey. Before she could respond, another voice interrupted their conversation. It was Anita, a younger woman from the community who had joined their table. Her presence was bold but not overbearing, her energy a quiet contrast to Evelyn's calm demeanor. "Sorry to intrude," Anita said, glancing between them. "I overheard a bit. Eleanor, if you're thinking of speaking out, you won't be alone. There are people here who would stand with you. Myself included." Eleanor looked at Anita, her initial apprehension softening into gratitude. The thought of not standing alone, of having others by her side, brought a flicker of courage she hadn't expected. "I'll think about it," Eleanor said, her voice steady but cautious. Evelyn reached for Eleanor's hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Take your time, but know that we're here for you." As Eleanor left the community center later that morning, the sun had risen higher, its light spilling across the sidewalk in patches. Her footsteps felt a little steadier, her shoulders a little lighter. She wasn't sure what her next step would be, but for the first time in days, she felt the quiet possibility of moving forward. The weight of silence, she realized, didn't have to be hers to bear alone. The morning of the community meeting was unremarkable in its quietness. The soft hum of Eleanor Williams's kettle filled her kitchen as she poured herself a cup of tea. The day stretched before her, and though her routine remained familiar, there was a tension in the air that felt heavier than usual. Today, she would share the story she had held close, and in doing so, expose herself to the judgment of neighbors and strangers alike. Eleanor wasn't sure what had pushed her to agree to the meeting. Perhaps it was Evelyn Clark's quiet encouragement or Anita's bold assurance that she wouldn't stand alone. Perhaps it was the memory of her mother's words, spoken decades ago but still resonant: "When they ignore your silence, make them listen to your voice." She finished her tea, rinsed the cup, and placed it in the sink. As she prepared to leave, Eleanor glanced at the mirror by the door. Her reflection stared back calm, composed, but carrying the quiet weight of the years. She straightened her cardigan, smoothing down the fabric with hands that trembled only slightly, and stepped outside. Blank. Blank. The community center was busier than usual, the parking lot dotted with cars. Inside, the air buzzed with conversation. Eleanor felt the press of eyes on her as she entered, her presence drawing nods and murmurs of acknowledgement. She greeted Evelyn, who was already seated at a table near the front, her ever-present floral scarf neatly draped over her shoulders. "Are you ready?" Evelyn asked, her tone soft but steady. "As ready as I'll ever be," Eleanor replied, managing a small smile. Evelyn patted her hand. "You'll be fine. Just speak your truth." The room gradually filled, the noise of shuffling chairs and low chatter growing louder. Eleanor recognized many faces, neighbors she had known for decades, church members, even Maria, the kind cashier from Greenfield Groceries, who waved at her shyly from the back of the room. But there were also strangers, people who had heard about the meeting through word of mouth or perhaps read about it in the small local paper. Anita, seated a few rows back, gave Eleanor a reassuring nod. The sight of the younger woman's determined expression eased some of the tension in Eleanor's chest. Blank. Blank. When the time came, Evelyn stepped up to the microphone, her voice carrying a calm authority that quieted the room. "Thank you all for being here today," she began. "We've gathered to discuss something that touches us all. Whether we want to admit it or not, how our community treats one another and how we can do better." She gestured toward Eleanor. "Today, we'll start by hearing from someone who has lived in this community for over 40 years. She has been a neighbor, a friend, and a pillar of quiet strength. Please welcome Eleanor Williams." The room erupted into polite applause, though the sound did little to ease Eleanor's nerves. She rose slowly, her steps deliberate as she approached the microphone. The weight of the moment settled over her as she looked out at the crowd, their faces expectant and silent. Eleanor took a breath, steadying herself. "Thank you for being here," she began, her voice calm but firm. "I didn't plan to speak today. In fact, I didn't plan to share any of this with anyone. But sometimes, life has a way of making decisions for you." She paused, her hands lightly gripping the edges of the podium. "A few days ago, I went to the grocery store, like I do every week. It was a day like any other until it wasn't." Eleanor recounted the events of that afternoon with quiet precision, the office's sharp words, the way their presence had lingered like a shadow, and the sting of their disrespect. She described the text message, the black SUV, and the unease that had followed her home. "I've lived a long time," Eleanor said, her gaze sweeping the room. "And in all those years, I've learned to pick my battles. But this felt different. It felt personal, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized that staying silent would only let it happen again to me or to someone else." A murmur rippled through the room, the sound of understanding and shared frustration. Eleanor felt a flicker of encouragement, though she kept her composure steady. "This isn't just about what happened to me," she continued. "It's about a pattern, one that many of you may recognize. A pattern of looking away, of pretending that things are fine because acknowledging the truth would be too uncomfortable." Her voice softened, but it did not waver. "I'm not here to point fingers or to cause trouble. I'm here because I believe we can do better. As neighbors, as a community. But that starts with acknowledging the truth. Blank. Blank." When Eleanor finished, the room was silent for a long moment before the sound of applause began, hesitant at first, then growing louder. She stepped back from the microphone, her hands trembling slightly as Evelyn rose to meet her. "You did beautifully," Evelyn whispered, guiding Eleanor back to her seat. As the meeting continued, others began to share their stories, small moments of prejudice, overlooked slights, and times when they, too, had felt invisible. Eleanor listened, her heart both heavy and hopeful. For the first time in days, she felt the weight of her silence lifting, replaced by something stronger, the beginnings of solidarity. Blank. That evening, as Eleanor walked home under the soft glow of the streetlights, she felt a sense of quiet resolve. The questions that had plagued her for days remained unanswered, and the shadow of the black SUV still lingered in her mind. But tonight, she was not alone in her unease. And that, she realized, was a start. The days after the community meeting passed with an unexpected quiet. Eleanor Williams returned to her routines, finding solace in the rhythm of ordinary tasks. The weight of the past week lingered, but it had shifted, softened slightly by the knowledge that she was not alone. The stories shared at the meeting had woven a fragile but real sense of solidarity, a reminder that her voice hesitant though it was, had resonated with others. Eleanor's morning began like many others. She brewed her tea, read a chapter from a well-worn mystery novel, and stepped outside to tend to her garden. The roses, a deep shade of crimson, were in full bloom, their delicate fragrance filling the air as she clipped away stray leaves. Yet, beneath the quiet of the morning, a faint tension stirred. It was the sort of unease Eleanor had learned to live with, a sense of being watched, of unseen eyes tracing her movements. She brushed the thought aside as best she could. Fear, she had realized, had a way of planting roots if given too much attention. It wasn't until the late afternoon that the tension returned in earnest. Eleanor was sitting by the window, knitting a soft gray scarf for Chloe, when she noticed the black SUV parked at the end of her street. It was subtle, almost unassuming in its stillness, but its presence struck a chord of recognition. She set her knitting down, her hands steady despite the pulse quickening in her chest. The SUV hadn't moved since she first noticed it, its dark windows reflecting the golden light of the setting sun. Eleanor told herself it might be a coincidence, but the thought rang hollow. Coincidences, she knew, had limits. Blank. Later that evening, Eleanor's phone buzzed with a text message. She picked it up hesitantly, the glow of the screen casting soft shadows across her living room. The message was brief and chilling in its simplicity. "You don't know when to stop." Eleanor stared at the words, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment, the room seemed unnaturally still, the quiet pressing against her like a weight. She resisted the urge to respond. Whoever had sent the message wanted a reaction, and she refused to give them that satisfaction. Instead, she placed the phone face down on the table and rose to her feet. She locked the doors, checked the windows, and drew the curtains tightly shut. The act felt symbolic as much as practical, a small assertion of control in a situation that felt increasingly out of her hands. The next morning, Eleanor decided to visit the community center again. She wasn't sure what she hoped to achieve, but staying silent, staying still, felt like conceding to the fear that had begun to take root. Evelyn Clark greeted her warmly as always, her presence a quiet reassurance. "You look like you've got something on your mind," Evelyn said, handing Eleanor a cup of tea. "I do," Eleanor admitted, her voice calm but firm. "That SUV I mentioned, it's still there. And I've received another message." Evelyn's face darkened, concern etching lines into her features. "Have you considered going to the police?" Eleanor hesitated, her thoughts circling back to Officer Harris and the dismissive way he'd treated her. "I don't think that's an option," she said carefully. "The same people who ignored me before, why would they listen now?" Evelyn nodded slowly. "I understand, but we can't let this intimidate you. Eleanor, there are other ways to address this. Have you thought about speaking to someone from the local press?" The idea made Eleanor pause. She had never sought attention, never wanted her struggles to become a spectacle. But the thought of others facing the same fears, the same shadows, pushed her toward consideration. "It's a risk," Eleanor said finally, "but maybe it's one worth taking." By the end of the week, a small article appeared in the local paper. It told Eleanor's story in her own words, weaving together the events at the grocery store, the unsettling messages, and the silent presence of the SUV. The piece was measured, almost understated, but it struck a chord. The response was swift. Neighbors stopped Eleanor on her morning walks to offer quiet words of support. Strangers wrote letters to the paper, echoing her experiences and calling for change. And though Eleanor felt the pressure of visibility, of being watched more closely than ever, she also felt a new strength. But not all responses were supportive. One evening, as Eleanor stepped onto her porch to water the plants, she found a note tucked beneath her doormat. The handwriting was jagged, rushed. "Enough. This isn't your fight." Eleanor read the note twice before folding it carefully and placing it in her pocket. The words stirred a mix of fear and resolve within her. This was, in fact, her fight, not because she had chosen it, but because it had chosen her. That night, as she sat by the window with a cup of tea, Eleanor watched the streetlights flicker on. The SUV was gone. But its absence didn't feel like relief. It felt like a pause. A momentary retreat. Yet Eleanor found herself less afraid. The support of her community, fragile though it might be, had shifted something within her. The echoes of racism, the silent assumptions, the unspoken judgments were not new to Eleanor. But now, for the first time in years, she felt a sense of momentum. She wasn't certain where it would lead, but she knew she couldn't let it fade. The road ahead was unclear, but Eleanor understood this much: change, slow and quiet as it might be, often began with the smallest of voices refusing to be silenced. The week after the article was published passed in a blur of subtle shifts and quiet confrontations. Eleanor Williams hadn't expected her story to ripple as widely as it had. But the response from the community was undeniable. Neighbors she'd only exchanged pleasantries with stopped her on her morning walks to offer soft-spoken support. A few, hesitant but sincere, even apologized for not stepping forward sooner. "You're brave," one woman said outside the post office, her voice tinged with a kind of guilt Eleanor wasn't sure how to address. "I wish I had your courage." Eleanor had offered a small smile in response. But the words stayed with her. Courage, she thought, wasn't what this was. It was something quieter, less chosen. She hadn't sought to be brave, she'd only sought to be heard. Blank. Blank. One crisp morning, Eleanor received a call from Anita. The younger woman's voice carried a quiet energy, a mix of determination and concern. "Mrs. Williams, I've been talking with a few people," Anita began. "There's a civil rights organization in the city that wants to hear your story. They've handled cases like this before, helped people bring attention to harassment and discrimination." Eleanor hesitated, the idea of expanding her story beyond the local community filling her with unease. "I'm not sure about all that," she said carefully. "I'm not looking to make this bigger than it needs to be." "I understand," Anita replied, her tone gentle, "but this isn't just about you. What happened to you happens to so many others. And most of them don't have the chance to speak up. Your voice could make a difference." The words settled heavily in Eleanor's chest. She thought about the faces she'd seen at the community meeting, the stories that had surfaced in quiet murmurs after her own. Anita was right. This wasn't just about her. "All right," Eleanor said finally. "I'll listen to what they have to say." Blank. Blank. A week later, Eleanor found herself sitting in a modest office downtown, a pot of coffee and a tray of biscuits between her and two representatives from the organization. They introduced themselves as James, a middle-aged man with a thoughtful demeanor, and Marcy, a younger woman with sharp eyes and a notebook poised to capture every detail. "We've read the article," James began, his tone measured. "It's clear that what you experienced wasn't an isolated incident. These patterns, intimidation, dismissal, they're far too common. We'd like to help you bring this to light." "What does that mean, exactly?" Eleanor asked, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Marcy leaned forward slightly. "It could mean a lot of things. We could help you file a formal complaint against the officers involved, connect you with legal resources, or organize a larger community effort to demand accountability. The direction is entirely up to you." Eleanor nodded slowly. She appreciated their clarity, but the weight of the decision pressed against her. Filing a complaint meant confronting the system directly, a system that had already shown its indifference. Organizing a larger effort meant stepping further into the spotlight, a place Eleanor had never wanted to be. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "I need a little time." James smiled warmly. "Take all the time you need. We're here when you're ready." Blank. As she rode the bus home, Eleanor stared out the window, watching the city blur into the quiet streets of her neighborhood. The conversation had stirred something within her, a mix of fear and resolve. She didn't know if she was ready for a fight, but she also knew she couldn't simply return to silence. That evening, as she sat by her window knitting, the faint hum of a car engine drew her attention. She glanced outside and saw the black SUV again, parked further down the street this time. Its presence no longer startled her the way it once had, but it lingered in her mind like a shadow. Eleanor reached for her phone and dialed Evelyn. Her friend answered on the second ring, her voice as steady as ever. "I've been thinking," Eleanor began, her voice calm but resolute. Maybe it's time I stopped waiting. What do you mean? Evelyn asked. I mean, Eleanor said, that it's time I stopped hoping this will go away on its own. Time I started moving forward. No matter how uncomfortable it might be. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then said, I think you're right. And you won't have to do it alone. Blank. Underscore. Blank. In the days that followed, Eleanor worked quietly but purposefully. She spoke with James and Marcy again. This time agreeing to file a formal complaint against the officers who had harassed her. She met with local activists who offered to organize a peaceful march. A way to draw attention to her story and others like it. And she began to speak more openly about her experience. Her voice steady despite the vulnerability it required. The march was planned for the following week. And as word spread, so did the tension. Eleanor noticed it in the way some neighbors avoided her gaze. In the murmured conversations that stopped when she entered a room. Not everyone supported what she was doing. And she understood why. Fear, she realized, had a way of silencing not just individuals, but entire communities. Blank. Underscore. Blank. The night before the march, Eleanor sat in her living room, staring at the simple sign she had made. Dignity for all. The words felt both ambitious and understated. A reflection of the quiet power she hoped to convey. As the clock ticked toward midnight, her phone buzzed with a text. She hesitated before picking it up, half expecting another warning. But the message was from Chloe. I'm proud of you, Grandma. I'll be at the march tomorrow. Eleanor felt a swell of emotion rise in her chest. The weight of the week momentarily lifting. She hadn't asked Chloe to come. But the thought of her granddaughter standing by her side brought a quiet strength Eleanor hadn't known she needed. The next day would bring its own challenges. Its own uncertainties. But as Eleanor turned off the lights and prepared for bed, she felt, for the first time in weeks, a sense of peace. She wasn't just moving forward for herself. She was moving forward for everyone who had ever felt small, unseen, or silenced. And that, she realized, was reason enough. The morning of the march dawned gray. The sky heavy with clouds that seemed undecided about whether to bring rain or simply linger. Eleanor Williams stood by her window, looking out at the street below. It was still early, the neighborhood unusually quiet. Her sign, Dignity for All, leaned against the wall by the door. The simplicity of its message reflecting the calm determination she felt. Eleanor had spent much of the night thinking about what lay ahead. The march had grown far beyond what she had imagined. Word had spread quickly through the community and beyond, drawing attention from local media, advocacy groups, and even a few city officials. What had begun as her quiet attempt to seek justice had become something larger. A reflection of the struggles shared by so many. Chloe arrived just after 9. Her youthful energy filling the house as she stepped inside. Good morning, Grandma, she said, embracing Eleanor tightly. Are you ready? Eleanor nodded, her calm exterior masking the flicker of nerves she felt. As ready as I'll ever be. They left together, walking the short distance to the meeting point at the community center. As they approached, Eleanor's steps slowed, her breath catching at the sight before her. The small parking lot was filled with people, neighbors, activists, friends, and strangers, all carrying signs and wearing expressions of quiet determination. Evelyn Clark stood near the front, her floral scarf wrapped snugly around her shoulders. Her smile warm as she waved Eleanor over. You've done something remarkable, Evelyn said as Eleanor joined her. I didn't do this alone, Eleanor replied, and I'm not sure I've done anything yet. Blank. Underscore. Blank. The march began with a steady rhythm, the crowd moving as one down the main street of the neighborhood. The signs they carried bore simple but powerful messages. Justice matters. Respect and dignity for all. Our voices will not be silenced. Eleanor walked near the front, Chloe by her side, Evelyn just behind them. The air buzzed with the quiet energy of the crowd, determined but not chaotic. Assertive but not angry. Eleanor found herself focusing on the sound of footsteps against the pavement. The steady beat a reminder that she was not alone. As they moved through the streets, residents stepped outside their homes to watch. Some waved or raised fists in solidarity. Others stood quietly, their expressions unreadable. Eleanor met their gazes with her own. Her steps unwavering. She knew not everyone would agree with what they were doing. But she also knew the importance of being seen. Blank. Underscore. Blank. When they reached City Hall, the march came to a halt. The steps of the building served as a makeshift stage, and the crowd gathered in the open space below. James and Marcy, the representatives from the civil rights organization, had helped organize the speakers for the event. Eleanor wasn't sure she wanted to address the crowd, but when James handed her the microphone, she didn't refuse. She stepped forward slowly, her hands gripping the edges of the microphone as she looked out at the faces before her. The weight of the moment pressed against her, but so did the quiet strength she had found in the days leading up to this moment. "I didn't expect to be here," Eleanor began, her voice steady but soft. "I didn't expect that a simple trip to the grocery store would bring me to this point. But sometimes, life has a way of forcing you to speak, even when you'd rather stay silent." She paused, glancing down at Chloe, who smiled encouragingly. "What happened to me wasn't new. It wasn't unusual, and that's the problem. The small slights, the quiet dismissals, the unspoken judgments, they add up. They weigh on us, slowly but surely, until we're carrying a burden that isn't ours to bear." Eleanor's voice grew steadier as she continued. "But we carry it anyway. And sometimes, when the burden grows too heavy, we have no choice but to lay it down and say, 'Enough.' That's why we're here today, not just for me, but for everyone who has felt that weight. For everyone who has been made to feel small or invisible or unworthy." The crowd was silent, their attention unwavering. Eleanor took a breath before finishing. "This is not just about me. It's about all of us. It's about the kind of world we want to live in, the kind of community we want to build. And it starts here with our voices, with our presence, with our refusal to stay silent." When she stepped back, the applause was quiet at first, then grew louder, spreading through the crowd like ripples in water. Eleanor handed the microphone back to James, her heart steady as she returned to her place beside Chloe and Evelyn. Blank. Underscore. Blank. That evening, Eleanor sat on her porch, watching as the last traces of daylight faded from the sky. The march had ended hours ago, but its echoes lingered in her mind, the steady rhythm of footsteps, the voices raised in solidarity, the signs held high against the gray sky. She felt a quiet sense of accomplishment, though it was tinged with the knowledge that the work was far from over. The march was only a beginning, a small step in a much larger journey, but it was a step nonetheless. And for that, Eleanor was grateful. As she sipped her tea, her phone buzzed with a message. This time, it was from a neighbor she hadn't spoken to in years. "Thank you for today. You reminded me what community really means." Eleanor smiled softly, setting the phone down. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but tonight, she allowed herself a moment of peace. The fight for justice was often quiet, often slow, but it was worth every step. And as she sat beneath the darkening sky, Eleanor knew she would take those steps as long as she could.